Ferrari's SF-25 has completed its shakedown in Fiorano a mere couple of hours after it was revealed the night before, and there's a lot of changes all throughout the car. Not surprising really, considering 99% of its components are brand new for the 2025 season. But while all of that may be true, some of you may be questioning, have Ferrari actually gone to the extremities that they needed to? Because the design or the look of the SF-25 is quite similar to that of last year's SF-24. But I can assure you the changes are vast, and they have opened up, as Ferrari themselves have stated, a bigger number of development directions for in-season development. Something from which the SF-24 suffered from last year, and some of these developments may even make their way onto the car in time for the season opening event in Melbourne. But let's go right into the SF-25 and go over the numerous and substantial changes that have taken place over the winter period. Now, interestingly enough, the front wing has not been touched at all from the season-ending wing they introduced in 2024 for last year's Singapore Grand Prix. And this is a very unusual decision, particularly with all of the changes that have happened further behind the front wing, such as the downstream geometric shape changes having been made further back. So obviously, this is an area from which the team will undoubtedly make changes, and I believe they've held off on making these because of the technical directive which will come into play in Barcelona at the Spanish Grand Prix at the kind of first quarter of the 2025 season. So that's why I believe they haven't made any changes to this area of the car. Further back, we now arrive at one of the most highly anticipated changes the team have been long expected to make, which is of course the switch from a push rod to pull rod front suspension layout on the SF-25. And it's not just a switch of layout having taken place, but also the mounting positions of all of these suspension elements have been changed quite dramatically for aero-related benefits, which is what the whole point of having a pull rod layout is all about. A perfect example is the front arm element highlighted on screen now. It's positioned much higher up on this chassis than it was on last year's SF-24. They have also retained the same positioning of the steering arm located forward of and above the lower wishbone forward element. This arrangement is possibly done for having multiple elements to use for flow conditioning ahead of the underbody. Interestingly, McLaren have taken their pull rod design to extremes for 2025, as you can see in this comparison. Now, which of the two is going to be the more successful, only time will tell as we get into the season, but it is something of interest to note nonetheless. The next part of the car that needs highlighting for a number of reasons is the leading floor fences, with all four of them having been repurposed for 2025 and the SF-25. But specifically, I want to highlight the second fence, which is acting as a vortex conditioner or a flow conditioner just ahead of the actual floor and the rest of the side pod area. Now, this is a brand new feature for this year, but it is a feature that has been used on a previous Ferrari car in this ground effect era, having appeared on the F175 during pre-season testing in 2022. So after 2 seasons without it, it's made a return. And of course, there is this interesting serration on the outermost floor fence, with this change along with the lowering of its overall height, meaning a reduction in drag. But this comes at a trade-off, being that this is where the main vortex for the floor is formed. Up next is the substantial changes to the side pods and the internal layout of them, which at first glance to all of you may not look very different from last year's SF-24, but that is not the case. Because as we all know, this is an area from which most of the performance for ground effect F1 cars are generated from, along with the floor, of course. While Ferrari has stayed with the overall same overbite concept that they adapted last year's SF-24 to with their Imola update and made further revisions to throughout the year, This season, the team have had further time to design and develop the actual sidepod concept from the SF-25's inception, rather than it being a somewhat makeshift redesign in the midway or beginning of 2024 like with the SF-24. This means it's far more structured and far more internally designed around this particular feature than it was last year, rather than it being a somewhat makeshift change in season. And with the changes to the front suspension also taking place, this is where the vast majority of the newly open development directions will be taking place from, in and around the floor region. To begin with, Ferrari have made wholesale changes from the geometry to philosophy of their sidepod inlets as well, the undercut and overbite for 2025. Unlike last year's philosophy of focusing on pressure outwash via the sidepod bottom surface, which is highlighted on screen, for 25, the sidepod vertical walls are now more in focus in terms of where they want the airflow directed, which again I've highlighted for you. And they now move out again, just like how they did on the SF-23A, the last time the team went with this particular philosophy. This has also meant that the inlets and overbite on the SF-25 had to be modified in tandem with this change. The inlet, for example, is positioned much further behind the wing mirrors over last year's SF-24, and this is perfectly illustrated by what's on the screen right now. So as you can see, the inlet on 2024 ended right where the wing mirrors were positioned on that car, whereas for 25 the inlet ends way before the wing mirrors are even in play in terms of it looking at one another. And this is to ensure no dirty air is sucked in and only taking clean air along the chassis. And on top with the overbite, a complex, highly intentional set of vortices have been created around the wing mirror and overbite mid-wing. Also note, whether this is just my feelings from the pictures and me seeing the SF-25 in person in Fiorano, it seems like this overbite has kind of followed the McLaren route of their MCL38, where it looks like it's kind of angled inwards. But I don't know whether I'm just seeing that and it's my mistake here, or whether they've actually done a particular thing with that. Now we come to the floor of the 2025, with the launch specification being very much the one they used in Las Vegas with Charles Leclerc last year. This is going to be a key area of development, as it has been for the past few seasons, and will be a major battleground for all of the big teams. The engine cover also features an all-new arrangement, with the shark fin now transitioning at the halfway point into outlets, very much like that of Alpine's last season. And with the overall engine cover transition into the sidepods, they have this very smooth shape and surface between them to help ensure that the flow attachment across a wide variety of yaw angles. Ferrari have also retained their triangular airbox design since the start of the ground effect era. And then finally we come to Ferrari's all-new, brand new medium low drag rear ring. Now this has taken elements from the F1-75 and the SF-24 and basically combined the two together for this new rear ring. And this should help with their DRS efficiency in comparison to that of last year's version, but also going up against all of their rivals, particularly McLaren, who after their kind of initial hugely highly controversial mini DRS had to make a revision, which they did at the end of the season. So this should help them in bridging the gap with the DRS efficiency over the likes of them, bringing them a lot closer to them in terms of their top speed on these medium lower downforce circuits. So yeah, as you can see and as I've demonstrated, there is a huge array of changes that have really changed the philosophy of what Ferrari are doing with the SF-25. It is quite a drastic change, even if it isn't one that looks overly dramatic from a visual sense. there are areas that look very similar to that of last year's SF-24, but the changes that they've made really do convey a change in philosophy from what they're trying to achieve this season. And of course, along with the front suspension change, this is going to have a dramatic effect on the overall aero balance and just what they're doing overall with the car, and all of the updates that they'll be bringing to whichever races that they can do for 2025. And overall, this is a much more refined car than that of last year, from front to rear. It is just a fantastic piece of machinery to see in person, and all of the intricacies and little bit of details and winglets here and there all throughout the car are going to help them, hopefully for their sake and just the season overall, bridge that gap to McLaren or whoever may be leading Formula 1 at the beginning of 2025, if Ferrari aren't themselves. Right, everyone, I am going to wrap this video up here. Hope you've all enjoyed it. If you have, do leave a like on the video, and if you're new, subscribe and turn on notifications for all future Formula 1 content from next week onwards, with pre-season testing taking place in Bahrain. Right, everyone, I will see you next week on the 26th of February for the season opening day of testing. I'll see you all then.